Biosols, Porter here. Welcome to a video on Chapter 56, Conservation Biology and Global Change, which is, of course, the brainchild of Beater and Barles behind the camera.
Back here.
So in this chapter, there's 5 key concepts that we're going to learn about. The first is human activities and biodiversity. The second is population conservation's relationship with population size, genetic diversity, and critical habitat. Landscape and regional conservation, sustainable biology, Earth's rapid change due to humans, and then the effects of sustainable developments. We'll go into each of those more in depth. So first we can look towards conservation biology. And conservation biology is the integrated study of ecology, evolutionary biology, physiology, molecular biology, and genetics to sustain biological diversity at all levels. And that's a really wordy definition, but essentially what it means is it's a type of biology that's focused on using the knowledge that we gain and learn in biology classes and the biology research in order to try and protect our environment and protect biodiversity. And this is incredibly critical that we continue to practice because basically as of 2020, we've altered basically half of the Earth's land surface and used over half of our accessible fresh water. And so learning to take our skills that we learn in the classroom biology and apply them to conservation biology is critical moving into the future. And one way that we can see evidence of this is through extinction. So extinction is an incredibly natural phenomenon. There's extinctions that happen every year, and trying to prevent all extinction would actually not be practicing conservation biology. It would be going against the forces of nature. But one of the things that we're seeing, and one of the things that's driving us to look towards trying to practice conservation biology a little bit more, is that the rate of extinction is occurring at a much higher rate now than we think that it's normally supposed to occur, which is indicating that we need to practice conservation biology a little bit more. So our first key concept has to do with human activities and biodiversity. And we measure biodiversity at 3 separate levels. So we look at genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And these all mean separate things that we'll go into in a couple slides. But humans constantly affect biodiversity by affecting trophic structures, energy flow, chemical cycling, and natural disturbance. And basically what all of these are, a lot of these are things that we'll talk about later. It's just a lot of the parts of our everyday life constantly affect biodiversity by infringing on other species and changing how their life actually goes about. So first we can look towards genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is basically genetic variation both within a population as well as within an entire species. So for example, Louisville, if you view Louisville as a population, has its own genetic diversity, but then Homo sapiens as a whole across the entire globe have their own genetic diversity. And losing genetic diversity by losing a single population can cause a lot of issues. Even if you, for example, just lost Louisville, because you reduce the adaptive potential of that species, especially within that particular environment. And so a good example of this is corn. A lot of the corn that we consume in the United States is just very genetically modified, white or yellow corn. But corn is actually an incredibly diverse crop, and if, for example, there was a disease that was going to wipe out most of our corn population, we could go and look towards the dozens of other corn species and try and find one that's immune to that disease, and then breed it into our current corn population. But if you lose genetic diversity, you lose the potential to do that. So the next way that we measure genetic diversity or biodiversity is through species diversity. And species diversity is essentially the variety of species in an ecosystem or across the biosphere. And when we look at species diversity, there's a couple terms that we use in order to describe certain species. So the first one is endangered species. And that's a species that, according to the U.S. Endangered Species Act, is, quote, in danger of extinction throughout all or a specific portion of its range. And its range is just the area where the species naturally resides. And then we also, one step below that, we have threatened species, which are species that are likely to become endangered soon. So it's by no means good to be a threatened species, but it's definitely better than being an endangered species. And as far as how common these are, 12% of birds and 21% of mammals globally are classified as threatened species, and that's just the ones that we know of. If you were to look at the fact that there's a lot of species that we don't even know about, and a lot of species, for example, in the Amazon rainforest that we're basically destroying the habitat of, this number could be, potentially significantly higher, or it might be a little bit lower. But just in North America alone, at least 123 freshwater animals have become extinct since 1900, with hundreds more that are threatened. And species constantly come on and off the threatened and endangered species list, but unfortunately it seems like, especially in the modern era, more are coming onto the list than are actually being removed. So finally, the final way that we measure biodiversity is ecosystem diversity. And ecosystem diversity is variety within a biosphere's ecosystem. So, like, one of the main ways that we can look at this has to do with local extinctions. So, for example, like wolves in general, aren't like kind of a threatened species, but they're probably not going to go extinct super soon. However, within Yellowstone National Park, wolves were completely eradicated. And so this is an example where ecosystem diversity really comes into play, because while wolves aren't an extinct species overall, for a long period of time we didn't have wolves in Yellowstone National Park, and that completely changed the ecology of Yellowstone. Because since wolves prey on the elk population basically grew like crazy, and because you have like a large elk and deer population in Yellowstone, what that ends up actually doing is like they completely changed the entire like plant habitat of the park by eating much more of the grass, which changed like literally even how rivers flowed within the park, and completely changed the ecology. And so now we've actually reintroduced wolves back into Yellowstone. And this is, one of the wolves, or a descendant of one of the wolves that we've very recently reintroduced. But this is what's key to understand here, is that losing a species isn't just critical on an individual, like global level. It's also critical that each individual ecosystem maintain their species, or else you can mess up the entire ecology. So, why do we care about biodiversity? Because a lot of this talks about, we're messing up like the individual ecosystem. But why should we as Homo sapiens, if we want to be incredibly selfish individuals, care about biodiversity? And there's a few different reasons for this. Then biodiversity is really incredibly important to us. So many species that are threatened or endangered or unfortunately have gone extinct provide medicine, food, and fibers for human use. And some excellent example of this are aspirin and penicillin. Were both derived from natural resources that were, looking at different species that were, in our planet. And without, the level of biodiversity that we have currently, we might not have discovered those. Moreover, losing diversity affects our ability to cultivate new species for agricultural development. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the corn example, and you can kind of see this a lot with rice, where, a lot of times you might need to develop a new species, or, take a species that already exists and make it more enduring to a specific virus or bacteria or fungus or something like that. And finally, we can look towards the fact that, like I said, aspirin and penicillin, 25% of all prescription substances were originally derived from plants. And so, once again, we can see this is incredibly important for the survival of our species. And then, obviously, there's the benefits of, just keeping the other species alive. Moreover, one of the major benefits is ecosystem services. So the environment does a lot for us that we don't necessarily, we really just take for granted that Earth does, but a lot of this goes away with biodiversity. And so a lot of these things like purifying air and water, decomposing and detoxifying waste, reducing impacts of weather and flooding, and pollination. And all of these services put combined are actually estimated at being worth $33 trillion a year in 1997. So, if you imagine taking that out to today's, dollars, you could see that being, upwards of potentially 40 trillion that this is worth globally. And so maintaining biodiversity really is critical, because without maintaining biodiversity, we are going to potentially place these ecosystem services in jeopardy. And so it really is actually in our best financial interest to protect the environment as much as possible, because, we want to have the clean air, clean water, we want to have our waste detoxified, and we need, plants to be pollinated in order for us to have the global crop yield that we need to feed our human population. So as far as threats to biodiversity go, because I've talked a lot about biodiversity being reduced, but not necessarily how exactly that happens. We're going to see four main threats. So the first has to do with habitat loss. The second has to do with introduced species. The third has to do with overharvesting, and the fourth has to do with global change. And really, unfortunately, basically all of these have to do are directly caused by the human species. You can even look at globally the human population in millions. As that goes up, the level of extinctions globally that go up of other species, of other non-human species. Uh, so the first threat is habitat loss, and human alteration is the biggest reason that we have habitat loss in the status quo. And this is largely due to things like urban development, agriculture, forestry, mining, and pollution that we're basically putting into the environment. And these factors directly account for 73% of the global extinctions that we see. And an excellent example of this is 98% of the tropical and dry forest of Central America and Mexico have actually been cut or burned down through either forestry or slash and burn agriculture. You can see an image of that here. And habitat destruction and fragmentation oftentimes leads to species loss. And one of the really critical things here that I'm going to talk about a little bit later is even if you don't destroy an entire habitat, just cutting lines through it and separating the habitats out can have major detrimental effects. And this isn't just exclusive to land. For example, 70% of coral reefs have been damaged by humans, which has major medical and biodiversity implications. So the second main reason that you see a loss in biodiversity has to do with introduced species. So introduced species are defined as species that humans have moved from native locations to new geographic locations. And this happens constantly. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's intentional. But oftentimes they can spread incredibly rapidly. And this is due to the fact that they're not susceptible to their usual pathogens, parasites, and predators. And two major examples of this that we've seen coming over from Asia in the last several decades are Asian carp and kudzu. And so this is an example of kudzu, which is a plant that basically just takes over, wherever it is, and just kind of grows on top of everything. And then these are silver-headed Asian carp. So, Asian carp basically are taking over a lot of our waterways, especially down the Mississippi River. And one of the things that we're really afraid of right now is that they're going to make their way into the Great Lakes, which would basically connect them to the rest of the United States. But they essentially take away a lot of the habitat for our natural fish species, things like, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, things like this. And kudzu, clearly can basically destroy an entire environment. I mean, it's cutting off sunlight for the rest of whatever is underneath it. And unfortunately, because these species don't have the natural predators, pathogens, things like that, if there's not something that's actively fighting back against them, they'll sometimes just grow to ridiculously large numbers, where, they're basically taking over an entire ecosystem. So the third main cause of the loss of biodiversity has to do with overharvesting. So overharvesting is the harvesting of wild organisms at rates exceeding their ability to rebound. So a lot of the times, when we harvest organisms, there's a level at which we can sustainably harvest them. So for example, with fish, we can sustainably harvest them up to the point where we're harvesting the same number that are reproducing and living, and then you keep the fish population the same every year. But once you exceed that level, you go into overharvesting. And this is really dangerous because you're affecting the actual principal amount of whatever resource you're taking. So some animals that have suffered incredibly from this are elephants, whales, and rhinos. And one of the easiest examples to see of this is overfishing in commercial fisheries across the globe. Just for example, the bluefin tuna was in 1980 basically considered not a super valuable fish. A lot of it was just put in cat food and it was sold for cents on the pound. But once Japan discovered the fish and started using it in sushi, now bluefin tuna will oftentimes go for hundreds of dollars a pound. And this made it quickly skyrocket, and to the point where just one decade later, from 1980 going into 1990, the bluefin tuna population was less than 20% of what it was less than 20% of what it was back in 1980. And so overharvesting can have a massive impact on the biodiversity the biodiversity of a population of an ecosystem, because you're just taking out way more species or way more organisms from this ecosystem than can actually be replenished. And then there's even other consequences too, especially with fishing, where you have bycatch, where you might be over harvesting blue tuna, but then you're also accidentally catching, dozens of other animals that are in the ocean, or and like through that bycatch, you're also reducing, biodiversity. So the final main link that we're going to see into reducing biodiversity has to do with global change. And global change is a very vague term, but the biggest examples that we're going to see are alterations to climate, atmospheric chemistry, and broad ecological systems. And so one of the major examples that the book talks about has to do with acid rain. So acid rain is defined as rain with a pH of less than 5.2. And this is incredibly effective at destroying biodiversity. For example, many lakes in Canada, Norway, and Sweden are experiencing mass die-offs of the fish that are within them because the fish can't survive a pH that low. The Canadian lake trout can't survive a pH of less than 5.4%, or of less than 5.4. But when we're consistently having acid rain, in Canada, due to American industrialization and the amount of toxic gases that we're pumping out into the atmosphere, then you create a situation where you're putting this acid rain into the lakes, and then the lake pH drops below 5.4, and the Canadian lake trout unfortunately die. Another example of this that you could see would be global warming and climate change. This is a graph of that we've seen since 1880, basically, the pre-industrial period to 2020, where we're at now, and we can see that very clearly. Global temperatures on average are rising basically every decade. So the second key concept that we can look at is population conservation's relationship with population size, genetic diversity, and critical habitat. And conservation biologists use two main approaches in order to actually try and conserve a population and keep it from going extinct. And this is mainly what this key concept is talking about. So your two main approaches are the small population approach and the declining population approach. So when we look towards the small population approach, we're going to see that small populations are incredibly vulnerable because they have a very small number of species, so you don't have to, not too many have to die